Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today we're going to look at a video that discusses what it calls the Evidential Problem of Suffering. And it's a pretty stupid video. And although I do want to give one sort of caveat before we go into this, which is that if you look at the world and think, this is an evil world, this is not a good world, this is not run by a good God, fine. I don't argue with direct perceptions, because you can't argue with direct perceptions. And if that's your direct perception of the world, well, you're being honest, and I respect that. You're wrong, but you're being honest, and I respect honesty. And moreover, you have to follow the best knowledge that you have. You are bound to follow your conscience, and you're bound to act upon what you find. So that I respect. This video, however, is not that. And this video does not deserve respect, and I hope you won't respect it either. So, let's take a look. This video opens with a kind of curious parable, with nice graphics, I will say.
Suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days, before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless.
That, so far as we can see, is very important, because what's about to follow is a very complex argument from ignorance. Hi. And I've got to say, I just love this setup. This is just such a perfect pseudo-intellectual setup. I mean, in the lower left-hand corner, we have the Twitter logo, artistically arranged with, good judgment in terms of placement and so on, signifying that there is somebody involved who is a graphic illustrator, which subtly suggests there is a team behind this. I don't know whether or not there is one or not, but, it always helps to suggest there's a team. There's the leather-backed chair. There's the button-down shirt, but we're not overly formal here. We're not trying too hard, so it's unbuttoned with not one, but two buttons. And that balance of formal but not trying too hard is extremely important, because the not trying too hard is what gives you the illusion the rest of this is not a carefully constructed image designed to persuade you. There's the blazer, again, signifying, we can't see whether or not there are any Professor Elbow patches. Be a really nice touch if there were. Again, they're the respectable sort of glasses, general background, and the stack of books is especially good. They're all, I believe, as far as I can see, Bibles in different ones. Some of them very, very worn, as if he's had them for a really long time or otherwise has access to a very large library, or possibly just a used bookstore. And then, of course, there's the curiously shaped lamp and the vaguely Chinese sort of bowl serving no discernible purpose, but these things go on to suggest that this is a man of wealth and taste. So I guess on that note, let's allow him to introduce himself.
I'm Justin Schieber, and you're watching Real Atheology. This illustration of the kinds of seemingly pointless and intense suffering which the natural world routinely visits upon its helpless residents was a passage from William Rowe's 1979 article, The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism.
Now, there's several things I could address in the previous thing. The intense part, for example, as if it really matters whether it's intense or not. It's just there to make it more vivid. The seemingly, which is a nice sort of hedge against the fact that this is simply no starting point, that, we observe something about which we know we have very incomplete information. And so he throws a seemingly in there in order to hedge against the fact that we don't actually know, but he's going to proceed anyway. Anyway, I'm not going to actually get into this stuff. Let's present the argument such as it is.
In that article, Rowe presents his now famous evidential argument from evil. In the context of arguments for or against the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good God, most people are going to be at least vaguely familiar with the logical problem of evil. And of course, this is a deductive argument, which attempts to show a logical incompatibility between the existence of such a God on the one hand, and the existence of any evil on the other.
Yes, as St. Thomas himself pointed out, in Objection 1 to the third article of the second question of the first part of the Summa Theologica, the third article being whether God exists, Objection 1 is, it seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable, but there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. That was published in the late 1200s, so yes, people should be fairly familiar with this argument by now.
However, in the last 40 years or so, these kinds of deductive arguments from evil have largely taken a back seat in favor of more inductive or evidential approaches to questions about God and suffering.
Probably because they don't work, and you can only try something for so long with complete failure before you kind of move on. I will note the Summa Theologica also has an answer to this, which is the standard answer. But you know what? I'm going to quote it. Reply to Objection 1. As Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless to bring about good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist, and out of it produce good. In the intervening 700 some odd years, people should have noticed that this argument doesn't in fact work.
This is not to say that I think that this trend is in the right direction or in the wrong direction. It's merely to note what seems to be the case.
Yeah. The fact that you didn't say that it was good or bad is kind of a hint. I mean, that said, this is the internet. I understand throwing in caveats. That was just a remarkably belabored caveat.
Now, William Rowe's article contains the most recognizable form of the evidential problem of evil, and it is that general argument which will be the topic of this and other videos to come.
So we're getting close to 2 minutes in and we finally learn what this video is going to be about. Okay.
In that article, Rowe's aim is to present an argument for atheism in the narrow sense, which he defines as the view that no all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely good God exists. In contrast to the logical problem of evil, Rowe's argument actually makes room for the compatibility of God and evil or suffering, but nevertheless insists that facts about the variety, the intensity, the number, and duration of instances of intense suffering in our world actually constitute some significant evidence against God as defined.
That is to say, when the logical version didn't work, people went to the next best thing of, well, okay, but obviously this world isn't good enough for there to be a God. Incidentally, I just summarized the entire thing, but here, listen.
To keep things simple, I will present Rowe's argument in a slightly different form, but a form which I believe fully preserves the important features and inferences of Rowe's original argument. Premise 1. Many instances of intense suffering seem gratuitous. Premise 2. Probably at least one instance of intense suffering actually is gratuitous. Premise 3. If an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good God exists, it would not permit any gratuitous suffering. Conclusion. Probably no omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good God exists. All other evidence held equal.
Yeah. Okay, so premise 1, the funny thing about this is premise 1 may be entirely true. Many instances of intense suffering may seem gratuitous. That leads absolutely nowhere unless it seems like this to somebody who is themselves infallible in their perceptions. Premise 2, by contrast, is simply groundless. Probably at least one instance of intense suffering actually is gratuitous. That probably comes from absolutely nowhere. That is essentially your conclusion. That is to say, there is no justifying premise 2. You can take it as an intuition if you want, but at the same time, that is simply taking God does not exist as an intuition, because premise 2 and what he calls premise 3, but essentially, it is absolutely clear that if premise 2 is true, then God certainly does not exist. He'll explain what gratuitous suffering is, but it actually does mean basically what the English word means. And so, you're simply saying, I don't think there is a God, and therefore, this suffering probably is gratuitous. Taking an extra step to say, and therefore there is probably no God, is just kind of absurd.
This argument makes use of the concept of gratuitous suffering. Now, this has a specific meaning in the literature. An instance of suffering is gratuitous if and only if it could have been prevented without thereby losing out on some greater good or permitting some suffering equally bad or worse. Put in another way, gratuitous suffering is suffering that God would prevent if he did exist.
Right there, you can see what I said earlier. If gratuitous suffering is suffering that God would prevent if he existed, saying that some instance of suffering probably is gratuitous is just exactly saying that God probably does not exist. You are actually starting from God does not exist, and then saying this suffering is therefore gratuitous.
The idea here is that sometimes allowing somebody to suffer is clearly justified, like, for example, the suffering of a child enduring a flu shot.
He belabors this a little bit, I'm just cutting it out. Presumably everyone understands why a flu shot is better. I mean, exercise is a much better example of this, because exercise hurts while you're doing it, but makes you stronger, but whatever.
But while we, with our limited abilities and resources, often have no better option but to allow this kind of suffering in order that we might, achieve some noble end, God, if he exists, would have no such limits on his power or his resources.
This is taking the absolute wrong approach to this. This is getting it utterly and completely backwards. Because this is taking the only difference between us and God to be our power, but not to be our intellect. This is assuming that God had the same intellectual ability as us, the same ability to handle complexity. It also, incidentally, assumes that God has the same limited knowledge as us. And it is then saying, if God was just a man, but more powerful, what would God therefore do? That is a useless, pointless, stupid question that applies to absolutely nothing. That applies to, at best, a 4-year-old's conception of God. Well, okay, being generous, maybe a 6-year-old's conception of God. By the time you're 7, if you've had any sort of decent religious instruction, you've already found out that God does not think like a 6-year-old.
In other words, God is the kind of being that could give you the beneficial effect of the flu shot without the intense suffering caused by the needle.
2 things. 1, the needle does not cause intense suffering. I hate getting needles under my skin. I have a deep psychological aversion to it. It may stem from the knowledge of what deep puncture wounds can cause, the bringing of bacteria and stuff. It's kind of more primal than that, I think. I just have a deep-seated aversion to willingly letting my skin, be punctured. That said, the needle doesn't actually hurt very much, and, I just overcome it through willpower and get a shot. I'm granted it'll hurt a little bit more if you really, really tense up, but nonetheless, needles don't actually hurt that much. It's not that intense a suffering. Not that that actually matters, but in any event, it isn't. However, this is, again, taking an incredibly, incredibly limited view of the matter. This is saying that the only benefit derived from the flu shot is, in fact, the conference of the, if you want to be accurate, probabilistic immunity to certain strains of the flu. And yes, it is certainly the case that God could do everything and have us do nothing. And if that were the case, if we were pure recipients without any sort of action, then yes, there would be no suffering in the world because God was doing everything and nothing else was doing anything, and therefore everything done would be perfectly good. However, there is, it sure seems like, a greater good accomplished by the world actually functioning rather than being a pure recipient. None of which is being considered here in any way, any shape, or any form, of course.
That brings us again to Rowe's illustration of the suffering fawn, which he uses to support premise 1.
Oh, goody.
Rowe wants to provide a potent example of seemingly gratuitous suffering that is of a commonplace type. So he focuses on non-human animal suffering.
Oh, and he even wants to make it more than that. He focuses on a fawn, because the exact same thing could happen to an adult deer, but, a fawn pulls at your heartstrings even more.
But why exactly should the fawn's suffering seem gratuitous to us?
Oh, come on! Why should the fawn's suffering seem gratuitous to us? Are your viewers complete morons? I mean, everybody on the other side, at least, I mean, maybe atheists watching this are this dumb. Everyone on the other side can kind of figure out this seeming part because we don't actually see any benefit being derived from it.
Well, Rowe writes, quote, "For there does not appear to be any greater good, such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good, or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse."
All of which just means that you don't know everything, which we already knew. You're supposed to be aware of the fact that as a human being, you don't know everything.
Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evils so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented, unquote.
Right, but you don't know anything relevant here. You're completely unaware of how the entire universe all fits together and works. You're just a person, and you are talking about the things that you could not know.
Central to Rowe's argument is that none of the usual theodicies seem remotely relevant in this case. Recall first that the fire in Rowe's illustration was started by a lightning strike rather than, being the result of the moral trespasses of some person or persons.
You seem here to be forgetting the fact that angels exist within Christian theology. And in point of fact, not all the angels are perfect. Some of them are evil. That's right. Remember, within Christian theology, human beings are not the only created intelligences that exist within the universe. They have their own good too. Angels don't exist purely for our sake. Angels do interact with us. Angels do us good. Bad angels also sometimes do us harm within Christian theology. Taking Christian theology as if the only thing that exists are human beings is really, really stupid. I mean, now, I often give a pass to people who seem to only be aware of fundamentalism because, I don't know, a lot of atheists are, for whatever reason, and you know what? You grew up in some place where the only thing that exists is fundamentalism, and for some reason you never found out what those evil Catholics are. Even when you realize that the fundamentalists you've rejected are wrong about pretty much everything, never occurred to you, you know what? Maybe the people they think are terrible aren't. Okay, fine, whatever. Unfair enough. I'm willing to sort of move on to a degree. I'm willing to give a bit of a pass. I know people who grew up in fundamentalist circumstances, and it is really bad. And I never suffered through that. So, as a general rule, I tend to cut people a lot of slack. But here, fundamentalists believe in Satan. They do a lot. They talk about Satan a lot from everything I've been able to see. I've read a lot of Jack Chick tracts, and he talks about Satan a lot. You have absolutely no excuse whatsoever for thinking that human beings are the only rational creatures with free will in all of creation. There is zero excuse for this. This is just stupid.
So it cannot be blamed on any particular abuse of free will. And because there was nobody around, nobody's really given a chance to express or grow in their moral virtue through some heroic rescue attempt, or to learn compassion or empathy through watching such a terrible tragedy. So really, on its face, this story does seem to identify an instance of gratuitous suffering.
Only if you throw it. I don't know why you're bothering with this. I mean, you have to throw so many assumptions into this that directly contradict the thing you're attempting to argue against, that you might as well jump straight to assuming your conclusion, which in any event is what you almost guaranteedly did. Assumed your conclusion, then you're just looking for some sort of way to justify it. I do understand that part. But that being said, the assumptions here are fast and furious and constitute basically the entirety of your argument.
Moreover, those who wish to defend this argument are not at all limited to Rowe's fawn.
You mean you could apply the same argument to an adult deer? To a moose calf? To a bison calf? To a baby turtle? To a baby sea otter? You're right. I mean, the sea otter would be a little bit hard with lightning, at sea, but, you could still, a shark bites its leg off and it bleeds to death slowly. Whatever. You can come up with stuff. I mean, given tiny amounts of creativity. So you don't say that this could be applied to more than just literally a fawn with a lightning strike, huh?
Defenders of this argument have both a large number and variety of instances of intense suffering to draw upon to make their case for the probable existence of gratuitous suffering. From chimp communities in Uganda, who pummel each other to death for land and resources, to the slow death creep of a particularly horrible disease or infection, to the child living in pain from extreme abuse or neglect.
Hold up there! I mean, the first two were, in fact, other examples of the same sort of thing. I mean, I don't know why you're presenting these things, because you'd have to be basically brain dead to not be able to generalize the fawn's case. But you now jumped to a human being suffering abuse at the hands of another human being, which throws out all of the things you said about the previous arguments about people's poor exercise of free will, and also about people's, heroic attempts to save and learning lessons and so on. How can you be incompetent at generalizing suffering in the natural world? If you know anything about the natural world, you know that there is a lot of suffering in the natural world. And yet, somehow, in trying to generalize, the best you can come up with are chimp communities, an unspecified disease, an unspecified animal, an unspecified condition, and a person which contradicts what you said earlier. This is absurd. This is absurdly incompetent. We need better atheists.
Not unlike the fawn and rose illustration, these instances of intense suffering also seem suspiciously like the exact kinds of suffering that God, as defined, would prevent if he did exist. Again, they seem gratuitous. They seem utterly lacking in justification. Furthermore, notice that this seems to remain true even after thinking very deeply about these issues.
You haven't thought deeply about anything whatsoever.
So premise one is quite obviously true. There do exist many instances of intense suffering which are at least seemingly gratuitous. This inference from premise one to premise two is a move that has been dubbed the Seeum Inference.
That is not what a premise is. If it's a premise, you didn't argue for it. Premises are the things in an argument you don't argue for. Premises are the things whose truth value you are taking as known at the outset of your argument. If you are inferring it, it is a step in your argument. It is not a premise. Just basic logic. Just basic logic. Moreover, there's no actual inference being made. This actually is a second premise. This is not an inference.
And the inference sure seems right.
No, it doesn't.
Right, we make similar inductive inferences all the time, and we feel fully warranted in doing so.
For example, suppose that after rummaging around in my fridge, I can't seem to find a carton of milk. It's unfortunately a regular occurrence at my house. Naturally enough, I would infer that there probably is no carton of milk in my fridge. Nobody would call such an inference unwarranted.
That's because you know the nature of milk, you know the nature of refrigerators, you know the relationships between these things, and whether or not there is milk in your refrigerator is the sort of thing that, as a human being, is actually within the limits of your intellect to discover by use of your senses in this fashion. You are using an example in which things work. Now, for example, as a counterexample, it would be very, very hard for people to find a prime number bigger than a googolplex, say, bigger than, the number 2 to the 100 billion, right? So that's really, really hard for us to do. With pencil and paper and so on. Nobody would infer from the mere fact that we cannot identify such a prime number, looking for it, to mean that there is no such prime number. In fact, you can mathematically prove that there has to be. That's because that's an example of a case where we know the human intellect isn't good at finding things. If you think the entire world is like finding milk in your refrigerator, you are stupider than that block of wood behind you.
And in the same way, if some instances of intense suffering are such that it's incredibly difficult to find even a possible justifying reason for God to permit that suffering, then it seems we should include that probably at least some instances have no justifying reasons. Probably they are gratuitous.
You are stupider than that block of wood behind you.
Now, if this reasoning is correct,
it's not.
If evils and their justifying goods are relevantly similar to fridges and their cartons of milk,
they're not.
At least insofar as you'd be likely to find the justifications if you went looking for them.
You're not.
Then it seems we should accept the inference from premise 1 to premise 2.
It's not an inference, and you shouldn't accept it.
What then can we say about premise 3?
Premise 3 is obviously true, you nitwit.
Often referred to as the theological premise. Premise 3 is pretty uncontroversial, actually. In fact, premise 3, or something relevantly similar to it, is largely assumed by both atheists and theists to be entailed by the very concept of God as being omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good.
You are spending a lot of time saying what absolutely nobody whatsoever disagrees with.
The conclusion that there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being is importantly an all else being equal conclusion. This means that the argument is attempting to provide some evidence against or lower the probability of God, and so if the arguments for and against God weighed in at an equal 50-50 stalemate prior to this argument, factoring in this evidence should tip the scales toward atheism in the narrow sense and away from the existence of God.
No, it shouldn't. This argument should do precisely nothing but convince you that the idiot making it is an idiot.
If, however, you thought that the probability of God was high prior to this argument should lower that probability. But perhaps not enough to make you an atheist in the narrow sense, perhaps just a less confident theist.
That's even more stupid. The existence of a thing which you do not understand, but which seems contrary to something that you have good reason to believe is true, is not the sort of thing that should lower your confidence in your conclusion. It's the sort of thing that should lower your confidence in yourself. It's the sort of thing that should lower your confidence that you know everything and that you understand things completely. You should not be confident that you know everything. Of course, you should be fairly confident that you don't know everything anyway. That's all this argument should lead you to.
This has been a brief unpacking of Rowe's famous evidential argument from evil.
Actually, it wasn't brief at all. It was very long and drawn out and slow in a rather gratuitous sort of way, basically trying to make it seem like there's a heavy weight to this argument because everything is said in this important sounding way, as if there's a lot of consideration behind every word.
Please leave your thoughts below in the comments section. In a future video, we're going to look at some important and powerful theistic critiques of Rowe's argument.
You don't need powerful critiques of this argument. What you need is laughter. This was just stupid. Really, really stupid. And I know we're supposed to all be ever so nice. No. This is below the threshold at which being nice is appropriate. This is wasting people's time. And moreover, it's not really wasting people's time. What this is doing is attempting to use completely irrational cues, such as cadence and tempo and set dressing and so on, in order to convince people that there is a serious argument to be had here, when there in fact is not. This is not even a slightly serious argument to be had. Now, I want to be clear, if you believe that we live in an evil world, and by the way, an evil world means a world that is not fundamentally good, not a world that is completely and utterly evil, because the latter would simply not exist whatsoever. Non-existence would be a perfectly evil world, because there is a complete absence of all good whatsoever. An evil world, as people use the phrase, means a world in which evil ultimately will win. The thing is winding down, there is nothing of any significance, eventually it goes away, and oh, don't tell me about how the world has the significance we give it. One of the key characteristics of reality is that it doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, and the meaning that you choose to give to life goes away when you stop believing in it. The reason why I have no respect for this, and nobody should have any respect for this, is because this is not rational argumentation. This is attempting to use sub-rational cues in order to convince people of something without any sort of argument, but simply by showing that here we've got the smart person who's on this side. That's disgusting. That's awful. This is the sort of thing that nobody should have any respect for. And here's the thing, we're talking about important subjects. Tea time rules apply to the chatter you have at tea time, or you're just politely enjoying each other's company. This isn't tea, this is real life, this is about things that matter. And here we have a person who is attempting to convince people that the source of all goodness does not exist, and that we live in an evil world, not through argumentation, but by various attempts to manipulate people at the sub-rational level. This is not respectable, and I'm done with this idiot. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.